November 1942, Camp Hood, Texas. The shaped charge demonstration left a hole in the quarter-inch steel plate that Corporal Tony Stein could fit his fist through. The training sergeant stood beside the scorched metal, holding up the M1A1 Bazooka like a salesman displaying defective merchandise. 23 infantry recruits watched from behind sandbags while Texas wind kicked dust across the firing range. The sergeant's voice carried skepticism that matched his expression. "This tube," he explained, weighed 13.3 pounds empty, measured 54 inches long, and fired a 3.31-pound rocket containing 8 ounces of pentalite explosive. The shape charge theory, he continued, suggested this rocket could penetrate 3 to 4 inches of armor at ranges up to 300 yards. Theory and reality, he reminded them, were different animals. Stein studied the demonstration plate. The hole was clean, the metal peeled inward in a perfect cone. The mathematics worked. 8 ounces of explosive, focused through copper liner geometry, created penetration beyond the explosive's raw power. But the sergeant was already moving on, already dismissing the weapon most recruits would call a stovepipe, or the wrong end of a telescope. The official designation was rocket launcher, M1A1, 2.36 inch. The unofficial designation was pipe dream. Stein had been at Camp Hood for 6 weeks. 27 years old, Cleveland metalworker, enlisted October 1942 after his brother was killed at Midway. 5'8", 160 pounds, unremarkable in every physical category except his hands. A decade of precision metalwork had given him steady fingers and an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems. While other recruits complained about field stripping the bazooka, Stein could disassemble and reassemble the weapon in 4 minutes with his eyes closed. He understood how the electrical firing circuit worked, how the Venturi nozzle directed rocket exhaust, how the optical sight calculated range through simple geometry. The weapon made sense to him. The doctrine did not. Training emphasized static defensive positions. Dig foxhole. Wait for enemy armor. Fire from concealment. The problem revealed itself during the second week of exercises. The bazooka's backblast created a smoke signature visible for 200 yards. Every practice shot announced the team's exact position. When Stein mentioned this to the training sergeant, the response was institutional. Infantry doctrine placed anti-tank guns in prepared positions. The bazooka was portable anti-tank capability. Therefore, bazooka teams held positions. The logic was circular and Stein suspected fatally flawed. But he was a corporal. The sergeants knew better. The other soldiers mocked the weapon with the casual cruelty of men facing uncertainty. Private First Class James Martinez, assigned as Stein's loader, called it his metal girlfriend. Others made jokes about shooting tanks with fireworks. The Marine liaison officer visiting from Camp Pendleton watched one training exercise and commented that the Japanese wouldn't be impressed. Nobody knew what Japanese tanks were actually like. Intelligence had minimal data. Type 95 something. Type 97 something, light armor, small guns. The details were vague. The training focused on German tanks because German tanks had specifications. Stein spent his evenings in the camp library reading everything available about Japanese armor. He found 3 paragraphs in a 1941 intelligence summary. Type 95, Hago, 7.5 tons, 37mm gun. Type 97, Chiha, 15 tons, 57mm gun. No armor thickness data, no combat reports, just vehicle weights and gun calibers. He sketched the tanks from memory based on a single photograph, drawing them from multiple angles, imagining where the armor would be thickest and where a 2.36-inch rocket might penetrate. By March 1943, Stein's unit received deployment orders. 3rd Marine Division, with attached Army bazooka teams for anti-armor support. The convoy assembled in San Diego. 47 ships carrying 12,000 men across the Pacific toward islands most of them couldn't pronounce. Stein packed his sketches along with his rifle, his entrenching tool, his gas mask, his personal effects. The bazooka and rockets would be issued shipboard. During the crossing, Stein befriended the ship's armourer, a Marine gunnery sergeant from Pittsburgh who understood machining tolerances. The armourer let Stein into the weapons locker during off hours. Stein disassembled and reassembled the bazooka 17 times, checking firing pin spring tension, inspecting the electrical contacts, measuring the barrel's internal diameter with improvised calipers made from wire. The armourer watched him work and asked if Stein had actually fired the weapon in combat. Never, Stein admitted. The armourer nodded. Nobody had. The weapon was too new. The Pacific Theatre was where theory would meet reality, where shape-charge mathematics would encounter Japanese steel. Intelligence briefings during the voyage provided updated information. Japanese tanks operated differently than German armour. Smaller, lighter, designed for infantry support rather than tank versus tank warfare. The Type 95 Heigo had 12 mm frontal armour. The Type 97 Chiha had 25 mm frontal armour. Numbers that meant nothing until Stein did the conversion. 12 mm was half an inch. 25 mm was 1 inch. The bazooka could theoretically penetrate 4 inches. The mathematics favoured the rocket. But American doctrine assumed tanks fought tanks. Infantry avoided armour, called for tank destroyer support, withdrew to prepared positions. In Europe, that doctrine worked because American armour was plentiful. In the Pacific, tank support was limited. Islands couldn't support heavy armour deployment. Infantry would face Japanese tanks alone, with nothing but bazookas and prayer. Stein realized this during a briefing about Guadalcanal. The Marines there had fought tanks with Molotov cocktails and magnetic mines, desperate measures against armoured threat. The bazooka was supposed to change that calculation, supposed to give infantry a chance, but only if the doctrine was right. The convoy reached Bougainville on May 12, 1943. Landing was unopposed initially, but Japanese forces counter-attacked within hours. Skirmishing, probing attacks, mortar fire. Stein's team dug positions along the defensive perimeter west of the beachhead. Jungle terrain, limited visibility, mud that turned foxholes into swimming pools after every rain. For 72 hours, Stein waited with the bazooka across his lap and 6 rockets stacked beside him like cordwood. Martinez asked how many tanks Stein thought they'd face. Stein didn't answer, because he didn't know. Intelligence suggested Japanese armour was in the area. 8 tanks, maybe more. But intelligence had been wrong before. At 0347 hours on May 15, 1943, the sound of tank treads ended speculation. Distant at first, then closer. Metal grinding on metal, engines straining. Stein crouched in his foxhole with the M1A1 bazooka, watching darkness where the jungle met the perimeter. Martinez loaded the first rocket without being told. His hands shook. Stein's didn't. 6 rockets, 8 tanks confirmed by reconnaissance, mathematics that didn't favour them. Dawn was 45 minutes away. The sound grew louder. 100 yards, maybe less. Stein pressed himself against the forward wall of his foxhole, the bazooka's tube cold against his cheek. Martinez crouched beside him, breathing too fast. The first rule of bazooka employment, according to Camp Hood doctrine, was maintain position and wait for optimal shot. The second rule was effective range 100 to 300 yards, closer being better for accuracy, but worse for survival. Stein had memorized these rules. Now he questioned every one of them. His radio crackled. Company commander's voice, scratchy through static. Enemy armour confirmed, 8 vehicles, mixed Type 95 and Type 97. Hold position, reinforcements in 90 minutes. artillery repositioning after previous engagement, unavailable for fire support. Stein acknowledged and killed the radio. 90 minutes meant nothing. The tanks would overrun this position in 20. He scanned the tree line through the bazooka's optical sight. The lens gathered what little light remained before dawn, turning darkness into grey shapes. Movement at 140 yards. The first tank emerged from jungle shadow like something prehistoric. Type 97. Chiha, squat and angular, riveted armor plates catching the pre-dawn glow. The rising sun insignia on the turret was barely visible. Stein could see the commander's hatch, open. Stupid or confident, he couldn't tell which. The tank moved cautiously, no infantry visible yet. Behind Stein, 40 men from his company watched. Riflemen with M1 Garans, machine gunners with Brownings, weapons designed to kill men, not armor. Every eye was on Stein's position. The weight of 40 lives pressed against his shoulders, like physical mass. The tank advanced. 120 yards, 100 yards. Stein's training said wait for optimal range, 100 yards or less. But training also said the backblast signature would reveal his position instantly. Fire and relocate was doctrine. But relocate where? Japanese infantry would be behind that tank, waiting to exploit any movement. His finger rested on the trigger guard. Not yet. The tank kept coming. 92 yards. The commander's hatch was still open. Stein could see the dark shape of a head. He aimed low, at the glacis plate below the turret, where armor transitioned from vertical to angled. The weak point, if training was correct. He squeezed the trigger. The whoosh was louder than he remembered from training. The rocket streaked forward, trailing smoke and flame. 3 seconds of flight. The shape charge hit the glacis plate and detonated with a crack that echoed through the jungle. The tank lurched forward, stopped, lurched again. Smoke poured from the driver's compartment. The commander disappeared down into the turret. Then the crew bailed out. 3 men running toward the tree line. The bazooka's backblast had filled Stein's foxhole with smoke and the smell of burnt propellant. His position was completely compromised. Japanese rifles opened fire from the tree line, 150 yards distant. Bullets kicked dirt from the foxhole's edge. Martinez was already moving, crawling north with the remaining rockets. Stein followed, dragging the bazooka, staying below the foxhole line. They covered 30 yards before dropping into a secondary position they'd prepared the previous night. Behind them, Japanese fire concentrated on the smoke signature where they'd been 5 seconds earlier. At 0409 hours, the second tank appeared. Type 95 Heigo this time, smaller and faster than the Chiha. The commander kept his hatch closed. They'd learned from the first tank. Smart. The Hago fired its 37mm gun towards Stein's original position, the shell exploding in empty dirt. Stein watched through the optical sight. The tank was moving at an angle, presenting its side armor, thinner than frontal armor. Training emphasized frontal shots, but training assumed static engagements. This tank was 78 yards away and moving. Stein led the target by 2 feet, compensating for movement and rocket flight time. He fired. The rocket struck the tank's side just below the turret ring. The explosion was immediate and catastrophic. Ammunition inside the tank cooked off in a series of secondary blasts. The turret lifted 3 inches and settled back at an angle. Flames poured from every opening. Nobody got out. Stein felt nothing about that. He was already thinking about the next problem. Doctrine said, relocate after every shot. Move perpendicular to the enemy. Maintain distance from original position. Predictable. Japanese would expect him to fall back toward American lines. Instead, Stein moved forward. He crawled toward the enemy, using shell craters for cover, advancing 40 yards into the space between the two forces. Martinez followed without question. The loader had stopped shaking. 4 rockets remained. The Japanese commander was adapting too. At 0434 hours, the third tank came forward, but stopped at 120 yards, outside what the Japanese apparently believed was bazooka range. The tank sat there, waiting, trying to draw Stein's fire. Behind it, Stein could see movement. Infantry preparing to advance behind armor. He stayed low in the shell crater, water from last night's rain soaking through his uniform. The tank waited. Stein waited. Martinez whispered that they should shoot. Stein shook his head. The range was possible, but not optimal, and firing would reveal their new position. 3 minutes passed. The tank commander made his mistake. He started to maneuver, turning to present frontal armor while advancing. The turn exposed the tank's rear quarter for 6 seconds. Stein took the shot at 45 yards, aiming at the engine compartment where armor was thinnest. The rocket punched through and the tank stopped immediately, disabled but not burning. The crew bailed out and ran. 3 tanks down. 3 rockets expended. 5 tanks remaining. Then all 5 appeared simultaneously. They emerged from the tree line in formation, 40 yards of spacing between each vehicle. Deliberate Japanese doctrine. Present multiple targets. Force the defender to choose. Overwhelm single positions with mass. They were learning his capabilities, adapting in real time. The formation advanced slowly, maintaining alignment. Stein could see infantry now, 60 or 80 soldiers moving behind the armoured screen. He had 3 rockets, 5 targets. The mathematics was impossible. If he killed 3 tanks, 2 would breach the perimeter. If 2 tanks broke through with infantry support, the American position would collapse. 40 men would die or be forced to retreat. He watched the formation advance. 150 yards, 140. His mind calculated angles and possibilities while his body remained perfectly still in the muddy crater. Martinez was looking at him, waiting for orders, waiting for the miracle that would solve impossible mathematics. The dawn light was growing stronger. In 15 minutes, visibility would eliminate every advantage concealment provided. Stein noticed the center tank had a longer radio antenna than the others. Command vehicle. Kill the command tank, create confusion in the formation. But 3 rockets, 5 tanks. The math still didn't work. Then he saw the terrain feature. A slight rise 60 yards to his left, maybe 18 inches of elevation. Not much, but enough to create dead space. An area invisible to tanks on the flanks. He could use that. Not to kill all the tanks. To channel them. Force them into a narrower front where conventional weapons might work. Make them bunch up. Martinez was still watching him. The tanks were at 130 yards. Stein grabbed the rockets and started crawling toward the rise. There was a way to win this. It required violating every doctrine they'd taught him. It required perfect execution with 0 margin for error. And it required luck. The tanks kept coming. Stein reached the rise at 0456 hours. The elevation gave him a view down into the tank formation that the Japanese commander hadn't anticipated. From ground level, the 5 tanks presented a coordinated line. From 18 inches higher, Stein could see the gaps between them, the slight variations in spacing, the way the center command tank lagged half a length behind the others. He settled into position behind a fallen tree trunk and aimed at the command tank. 110 yards. The crosshairs steady on the turret. Martinez loaded the rocket without being told. Stein fired. The rocket hit clean. The command tank stopped immediately, smoke pouring from the turret hatches. The crew tried to bail, but only 2 made it out before ammunition started cooking off inside. The flanking tanks halted within seconds. No radio orders told them what to do next. Confusion rippled through the formation. They sat there, 4 tanks waiting for instructions that would never come. Stein didn't wait either. He swung the bazooka left toward the tank on the far left of the line. 135 yards. He aimed low at the track, not trying to kill it, just immobilize it. The rocket hit the track assembly and the tank lurched sideways. The track separated, wrapping around the road wheels. The tank could still fire its gun, but couldn't move. An obstacle now, not a threat. The right side tank started moving. They turned inward, routing around the disabled command tank, bunching toward the center. Exactly what Stein wanted. He chambered his last rocket. The rightmost tank was moving to fill the gap. 128 yards. Stein aimed at its track and fired. Another mobility kill. The track shattered and the tank ground to a halt. Now 5 tanks were channeled into a 40-yard corridor. 2 mobile, 3 disabled. The mobile tanks advanced cautiously through the gap. They expected another rocket. Stein had none. He turned to Martinez and told him to run back to American lines. Bring every rifleman with grenades. Martinez stared at him. Stein repeated the order. Martinez sprinted back across 80 yards of open ground while Japanese rifles tracked him. Bullets kicked up dirt at his heels, but he made it. Stein stayed in position with the empty bazooka. The 2 mobile tanks didn't know he was out of ammunition. They crept forward 5 yards at a time, waiting for the rocket that wouldn't come. Their caution bought the time Stein needed. At 0519 hours, Martinez returned with 12 riflemen. Each man carried 2 or 3 fragmentation grenades. Stein gave them the briefest possible instruction. Tracks and vision ports only. The grenades wouldn't penetrate armor, but they could disable mobility and blind the crew. The tanks were at 40 yards from the American line now. Close enough. Stein gave the signal. 12 men rushed the 2 mobile tanks from both sides simultaneously. The tank crews had limited visibility through narrow vision slits. They saw movement too late. Grenades hit the tracks on both tanks within seconds. The explosions tore apart the track assemblies and road wheels. Both tanks stopped. The crews tried to traverse their turrets but couldn't track fast enough. More grenades against the vision ports. The glass cracked and shattered. Smoke filled the tank interiors. Both crews bailed out and were cut down by rifle fire before they could run 10 feet. At 0547 hours, all 8 Japanese tanks were disabled or destroyed. 3 kills and 2 mobility kills from Stein's bazooka. 2 mobility kills from infantry grenades. The 3 immobilized tanks with functioning guns were abandoned by their crews. 0 American casualties from the entire engagement. The company commander arrived at Stein's position 15 minutes later. Captain Morris walked among the disabled tanks, studying the impact points, the blast patterns, the way they were positioned. He reconstructed the fight from physical evidence, the spacing of the kills, the backblast marks showing Stein had fired from 3 different positions, the track damage showing deliberate targeting. Morris asked Stein to explain what happened. Stein walked him through it. The shoot and move doctrine he'd invented because staying in one place meant dying. The mobility kills instead of catastrophic kills because mission success was stopping the tanks, not destroying them. The terrain exploitation to channel the enemy formation. The combined infantry assault once the tanks were funneled into the killing zone. Morris listened without interrupting. Then he asked why Stein had violated orders to hold position. Stein said holding position would have gotten everyone killed. The bazooka's backblast signature revealed location instantly. Staying static made the team a target instead of a threat. Mobility was survival. The doctrine they'd been taught assumed prepared defensive positions with overlapping fields of fire and artillery support. This situation had none of those things. So he adapted. Morris nodded slowly. He told Stein to write an after-action report with detailed tactical recommendations. Battalion intelligence would photograph the kill pattern and disabled tanks. Other Bazooka teams were already asking questions about Stein's technique. Word was spreading through the regiment. The corporal, with the mail-order rifle mentality, had just changed how infantry fought armour. That afternoon, Stein sat in his foxhole cleaning the bazooka. His hands moved through the disassembly process automatically, while his mind worked through the problem. The weapon functioned exactly as designed. The shape charge penetrated armour. The rocket flew true. But the doctrine was wrong. Teaching bazooka teams to fight like stationary, anti-tank guns ignored the weapon's greatest advantage. It was portable. A man could carry it, fire it, and move before the enemy could respond. The bazooka wasn't a defensive weapon. It was a hunting weapon. And the crew wasn't prey waiting in a hole. They were predators who could move and think and adapt faster than a 15-ton tank could respond. Martinez asked if they'd get in trouble for ignoring orders. Stein said he didn't know, but he knew they'd survived. And 8 Japanese tanks hadn't. That mathematics mattered more than doctrine. By evening, battalion headquarters confirmed 3 more Japanese tank encounters in other sectors. Stein spent 2 hours with each bazooka team that had engaged armour. He explained what worked. Shoot and move immediately. Never fire twice from the same position. Use terrain to force enemy movement into predictable channels. Target mobility instead of destruction when ammunition is limited. The teams listened because Stein had solved a problem they all faced. How to fight armour with a weapon everyone called a pipe dream. The answer wasn't better equipment. It was better thinking. That night, Stein couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the command tank exploding, the crews bailing out, the mathematics of 3 rockets against 5 tanks. Impossible odds that stopped being impossible once he changed how he thought about the problem. The bazooka hadn't changed. The tanks hadn't changed. His willingness to abandon doctrine had changed everything. The Bougainville campaign continued through the end of May 1943. Stein conducted informal training sessions with 6 other bazooka teams between combat operations. They met behind the supply depot where salvaged Japanese tanks sat rusting in the tropical humidity. Stein used the wrecks as teaching aids, showing the other teams exactly where his rockets had penetrated, explaining why he'd chosen each impact point. The crews watched and asked questions that revealed how differently they'd been thinking about the problem. One team leader admitted he'd been planning to let tanks pass his position and shoot them from behind. Suicide tactics born from defensive doctrine. Stein explained that mobility meant you could create the behind shot without waiting in a hole for the tank to pass. You moved to the flank, took the shot, moved again before the enemy could respond. 3 more Japanese tank engagements occurred during those 2 weeks. Bazooka teams using Stein's mobile tactics destroyed 11 tanks total with 2 American casualties, both wounded, neither killed. The previous month, a different regiment had faced 8 Japanese tanks and lost 14 men before withdrawing without destroying a single enemy vehicle. The battalion commander noticed the disparity. He ordered Stein to write a detailed after-action report with tactical diagrams. Stein spent 3 nights filling notebook pages with hand-drawn sketches showing movement patterns, fields of fire, optimal shooting, positions relative to terrain features. He labelled each diagram with distances and angles. His handwriting was mechanical and precise. The letters formed with the same attention to measurement he'd learned in the machine shop. The report went up the chain of command. Battalion forwarded it to regiment. Regiment forwarded it to division. By mid-June, Stein received a field promotion to sergeant and orders to prepare a training program for replacement bazooka teams arriving before the Tarawa invasion. He had 3 weeks and 40 Marines who'd never fired the weapon in combat. Stein started with the fundamental principle everyone had gotten wrong. The bazooka wasn't a defensive weapon that made infantry positions stronger. It was a mobile weapon that made infantry more dangerous. He told them to forget about foxholes and fields of fire. Think like hunters, not targets. Armor moved predictably because weight and terrain limited options. A two-man team could reposition faster than a 15-ton tank could traverse its turret. Speed and unpredictability beat armor and firepower. The training took place on a makeshift range 2 miles from the main camp. Stein had the Marines practice shoot and move sequences under time pressure. Fire, displace 30 yards, fire again. He timed them with a stopwatch borrowed from the battalion aid station. Any team that took longer than 45 seconds between shots had to repeat the drill. He was harder on them than any training sergeant at Camp Hood had been on him. But these men would face Japanese armor within weeks. Sympathy would get them killed. By the third week, 32 of the 40 Marines could hit man-sized targets at 300 yards and reposition before an imaginary enemy could return fire. Stein divided them into 16 two-man teams and drilled them on the communication that kept both men alive. The shooter focused on the target. The loader watched everywhere else, called out threats, carried extra rockets, and kept his rifle ready for infantry that always accompanied armor. November 20th, 1943. Tarawa Atoll. The intelligence briefing revealed a different challenge than Bougainville. Japanese had 14 Type 95 tanks dug in as static fortifications rather than mobile armor. They'd learned from earlier defeats. Buried tanks were harder to kill. Stein's teams would need to adapt again. The invasion was brutal from the first minute. Marines landed under heavy fire, struggled across the reef, died in the water before reaching the beach. Stein's team made it ashore in the second wave. Within an hour, they encountered the first buried tank. It sat in a reinforced position with only the turret exposed, firing its 37mm gun down the beach approach. Frontal shots were impossible. The turret armor was too thick and the angle was wrong. Stein studied the position for 10 minutes, watching how the tank fired, how the crew operated. Then he noticed the approach from the left flank offered a sightline to the tank's side where it met the buried position. Not a clean shot, but possible. His team crawled 200 yards through sand and coral, using destroyed landing craft for cover. They reached a position 60 yards from the tank's flank. Stein aimed at the thin side armor just below the turret ring where the hull was partially exposed above the pit. The rocket hit and penetrated. The tank didn't explode, but smoke poured out and the gun went silent. The crew tried to bail, but only one man emerged before the rest were overcome. 1 kill, but it had taken 40 minutes of careful approach. 14 tanks on the island. If each required 40 minutes, the battle would last days. Stein realized the doctrine needed another modification. Static tanks required different tactics than mobile armor. Flanking approaches took too long under fire. They needed faster solutions. Over 3 days of fighting, Stein's teams destroyed 9 of the 14 Japanese tanks. Other weapons accounted for the remaining 5. Flamethrowers proved effective against buried positions, as did demolition charges. The Marine Corps began integrating these lessons immediately. Tank hunting required combined arms. Bazookas for mobility kills and penetration, flamethrowers for forcing crews out, demolitions for finishing disabled vehicles. No single weapon solved every problem. December 1943 brought orders recalling Stein to Camp Pendleton. The Marine Corps schools wanted him to help formalize anti-armor doctrine into official training manuals. He spent 4 months working with a committee of officers and senior NCOs, translating combat experience into institutional knowledge. The manual they produced was titled Mobile Anti-Armor Tactics for Infantry. The key principles read like a distillation of everything Stein had learned through trial and error. Bazooka teams operate as mobile hunters, not static defenders. Primary and alternate firing positions planned before engagement. Teams operate in pairs for mutual support and overlapping fire. Terrain exploitation to channel enemy movement. Target priority based on threat and opportunity, not predetermined doctrine. Mobility kills acceptable when ammunition limited or tactical situation demands. Team leaders authorized to reposition without company commander approval. That last principle was revolutionary. It decentralized decision-making, trusting corporals and sergeants to read the tactical situation and adapt. The old doctrine had treated enlisted men as weapons to be positioned by officers. The new doctrine treated them as thinking soldiers who could solve problems independently. The changes spread beyond the Marine Corps. Army units training for European deployment adopted similar tactics. Intelligence reports from Italy showed American Bazooka teams successfully engaging German armor using mobile hunter techniques. The lessons from the Pacific were being validated in a completely different theater against a completely different enemy. The fundamental principle held true regardless of location. A man with the right weapon and the right training could hunt tanks. He didn't need to be bigger or stronger or better armored. He needed to think faster and move smarter. Stein's innovation wasn't technical. The bazooka existed before him. His innovation was conceptual. He changed how infantry thought about their relationship to armor. Tanks weren't invincible threats to be avoided. They were targets to be hunted. That shift in mindset transformed infantry from victims of mechanized warfare into active participants who could shape the battlefield. By mid-1944, every Marine and Army bazooka team trained under doctrine that traced directly back to May 15, 1943, when one corporal with 3 rockets faced 5 tanks and decided that impossible mathematics just meant he needed to think differently. February 19, 1945. Iwo Jima. Staff Sergeant Tony Stein came ashore with the 28th Marines, 5th Division, in the 3rd Assault Wave. By 1945, the tactics he'd pioneered at Bougainville were standard doctrine across the Marine Corps. Every bazooka team trained in mobile anti-armor operations. Every team leader understood shoot-and-move principles. But Iwo Jima presented a challenge that doctrine hadn't anticipated. Intelligence confirmed 23 Japanese tanks on the island, but they weren't mobile armor. They were buried fortifications, dug into the volcanic ash with overhead cover and limited firing ports. Static defense taken to its logical extreme. The tanks had become pillboxes that happened to have turrets. The first 48 hours were chaos. Landing under artillery fire, establishing the beachhead, pushing inland through terrain that offered zero cover. Black volcanic sand that swallowed men to their knees. Stein's team was assigned to neutralize tank positions around Mount Suribachi, the volcanic cone dominating the southern tip of the island. 7 buried tanks identified through reconnaissance, each position carefully sighted to cover approaches with interlocking fire. February 21st, 1945. Stein spent the morning studying the first position through binoculars from 60 yards distance. The tank sat in a reinforced pit with coral and logs covering everything except a narrow firing port. The Type 97's 57mm gun covered the approach to Suribachi's base. Any frontal assault would walk directly into that gun. His loader was PFC Robert Hansen, a replacement from Ohio who joined the team after Tarawa. Hansen asked the obvious question. How do you kill a tank you can't see? Stein had noticed something during his observation. The tank sat at an angle in its pit, nose down to reduce the target profile. But the angle meant the underside was partially exposed, where the hull rested on buried oil drums for support. The belly armor on any tank was thinner than frontal or side armor. Manufacturers assumed threats came from horizontal directions, not from below. Stein explained his plan to Hansen. They would crawl forward using shell craters for concealment, advance to within 25 yards, shoot upward at a 20-degree angle, targeting the exposed underside where it sat on the drums. The shaped charge would penetrate the thin belly armor, and the secondary explosion of the fuel drums would do the rest. Hansen asked if this was in the manual. Stein said no, he was writing new pages. They crawled forward at 1410 hours, 10 yards at a time, using craters and coral outcroppings for cover. The advance took 30 minutes to cover 40 yards. Japanese rifles fired sporadically from positions around the tank. Bullets cracked overhead. At 25 yards, Stein went prone and aimed the bazooka upward. The angle was awkward. The weapon was designed for horizontal fire, not indirect shots. He compensated by feel, adjusting the tube angle until it looked right. Hansen loaded the rocket. Stein fired. The rocket hit the oil drums beneath the tank's belly. The initial explosion was followed immediately by a larger secondary blast as the drums ruptured. The tank lifted slightly and settled back at a collapsed angle. Smoke poured from the firing port. Nobody came out. One kill, but it had required 30 minutes of exposed crawling and a shot that violated every training manual. Over the next 2 days, Stein's team destroyed 4 more buried tanks using the belly shot technique. Other teams observed and adopted the method. By February 26th, all 7 tanks around Suribachi were neutralized. The mountain was declared secure on February 23rd. The famous flag raising occurred while Stein was working his way north toward the main Japanese defensive line. The northern sector was worse. 16 buried tanks remained, integrated into a network of caves and tunnels that connected the entire defensive system. Tank positions weren't isolated strongpoints. They were nodes in a larger fortification where Japanese soldiers could move underground between positions, reinforcing or retreating without exposure to American fire. March 1st, 1945. Stein's team was assigned to clear tank positions near Hill 382. The standard approach wouldn't work. Belly shots required direct line of sight to the underside. These tanks were buried deeper with better overhead cover. Stein spent 2 days studying the problem before he understood the solution. The tunnel system that made the defenses stronger also made them vulnerable. If his team could access the tunnels, they could approach tank positions from behind through the underground network. It required coordination with flamethrower teams and demolitions, a combined arms operation that violated the independence bazooka teams usually operated with. But the situation demanded adaptation. March 3rd, 1945. The assault began at 0600 hours. Flamethrower teams entered the tunnel system at a captured entrance point 80 yards from the first tank position. They advanced through the tunnels, clearing Japanese defenders with fire. Stein's team followed 20 yards behind with demolition specialists. The tunnels were narrow, dark, filled with smoke and the smell of burnt flesh. They advanced by feel, following the flamethrower team's path. At 30 yards from the tank position, they found a junction where the tunnel branched. One branch led to the tank's rear access hatch. Stein could see daylight filtering through cracks around the hatch. The tank crew had sealed it from inside with sandbags and debris. But it was still the weak point in their defense. Demolitions placed shaped charges against the hatch. Everyone retreated 20 yards before detonation. The explosion blew the hatch inward. Stein moved forward immediately through smoke and debris. The tank's interior was chaos. Crew members disoriented by the blast. Stein fired his carbine through the open hatch. Hansen threw grenades. The tank was neutralized without using a single bazooka rocket. The tactic worked because they'd approached from the direction the Japanese hadn't defended. Tanks buried as pillboxes focused their defenses forward. The rear was vulnerable if you could reach it. Between March the 3 and March 14th, Stein's team destroyed 6 tanks using tunnel approaches. Other teams destroyed 10 more using either belly shots or tunnel tactics. By March 26, when Iwo Jima was declared secure, all 23 Japanese tanks had been neutralized. Bazooka teams were credited with 19 kills. The remaining 4 were destroyed by airstrikes and naval gunfire. The cost was measured in more than statistics. Stein's team rotated 4 different loaders through Hansen's position. Wounds, exhaustion, combat fatigue. Hansen himself was wounded on March 8 by shrapnel from a mortar round. He survived and was evacuated. Stein took shrapnel wounds twice, both minor enough that corpsmen patched him up and sent him back to his unit within hours. 35 days of continuous combat reduced him from 160 pounds to 138. His hands shook when he tried to write. He stopped sleeping for more than 2 hours at a stretch. The nightmares were less about combat than about the men who hadn't made it. Martinez, his original loader from Bougainville, had been killed at Tarawa. PFC Thomas Chen had been killed at Iwo Jima on February 24th. Men Stein had trained, men who'd trusted his tactics, men who'd done everything right and died anyway, because combat was mathematics that included random variables no doctrine could eliminate. April 1945. Stein was evacuated stateside with orders to Camp Pendleton. The Marine Corps awarded him the Navy Cross for actions between February 21st and March 14th. The citation specifically mentioned innovative anti-armor tactics that saved American lives and accomplished mission objectives against fortified enemy positions. But Stein filed the medal in his footlocker and tried not to think about it. Recognition for tactical success felt obscene when weighed against the cost. He became chief instructor at the anti-armor school, training Marines for the planned invasion of Japan. The invasion that would require crossing beaches against buried tanks and prepared defenses that made Iwo Jima look like a training exercise. August 1945. Japan surrendered. The invasion was cancelled. Stein was discharged in November with the rank of gunnery sergeant. He returned to Cleveland and tried to forget that he'd become an expert at killing men inside steel boxes. The war ended, but the lessons continued. Between 1946 and 1950, the Marine Corps analysed every anti-armour engagement from the Pacific campaigns. Staff officers studied after-action reports, examined kill patterns, and interviewed surviving team leaders. The data was overwhelming. Mobile anti-armour tactics had achieved a 73% success rate against Japanese armour compared to 34% for static defensive positions. The difference wasn't the weapon. The M1A1 bazooka performed identically in both doctrines. The difference was how men thought about using it. In 1949, the Marine Corps published Fleet Marine Force Manual 6-4, the official doctrine for infantry regiment operations. Chapter 7 covered anti-armour tactics. Every principle traced directly back to Bougainville. Bazooka teams are designated as maneuver elements rather than defensive positions. Shoot and move cycles formalized with recommended displacement distances. Terrain exploitation for enemy channelization. Target priority based on tactical situation rather than predetermined hierarchy. Team leader autonomy to reposition without higher approval. The manual didn't mention Tony Stein by name, but his fingerprints were on every page. The Army adopted parallel doctrine for units facing Soviet armour in Europe. The threat was different. T-34 tanks with thicker armour and better guns than anything Japan had fielded. But the tactical principles remained valid. Mobility, unpredictability, terrain exploitation. A two-man team with the right training could hunt 30-ton tanks if they thought like predators instead of prey. June 1950. North Korea invaded South Korea with 150 T-34 tanks spearheading the assault. American forces were unprepared, under-equipped, and pushed back to the Pusan perimeter. But the bazooka teams remembered their training. They used mobile tactics against armour that outnumbered and outgunned them. By the end of the Korean War in 1953, North Korean and Chinese forces had lost 97 tanks to American infantry anti-tank weapons. Bazooka teams were credited with 34 of those kills. The tactics worked against communist armor the same way they'd worked against Japanese armor. The enemy changed, but the mathematics didn't. The weapons evolved. The M20 Super Bazooka replaced the M1A1 in 1950, firing a larger 3.5-inch rocket with better penetration. The M72 Law arrived in the 1960s, a disposable one-shot weapon light enough that every rifleman could carry one. The concept had evolved from Stein's insight about mobility. If the weapon was light and disposable, you could distribute anti-armor capability throughout the entire infantry unit instead of concentrating it in specialized teams. Every soldier became a potential tank hunter. The Dragon missile system in the 1970s added wire guidance for precision. The Javelin in the 1990s added fire-and-forget targeting with top attack capability. Each weapon was technologically superior to its predecessor, but the doctrine underlying their employment remained unchanged. Shoot and move. Use terrain. Think faster than the enemy can react. Training at Fort Benning and Camp Pendleton still use case studies from Pacific campaigns. Instructors taught mobility principles without knowing the name of the corporal who'd invented them during 4 days at Bougainville. Tony Stein never spoke about the war. He returned to Cleveland in 1945, married in 1947, and raised 3 children. He worked as a machinist at a tool and die shop. The same precision metalwork he'd done before enlisting. His family knew he'd served in the Pacific. They saw the Navy Cross in his dresser drawer alongside his discharge papers. They didn't know what he'd done to earn it. Stein kept those memories private, locked away where they couldn't contaminate normal life. In 1975, the Marine Corps Historical Division contacted him. They were conducting oral history interviews with Pacific veterans, preserving first-hand accounts before the generation died. Stein initially refused. Then he reconsidered. Not for himself, but for Martinez and Chen and Hansen and the other men who trusted his tactics. Their stories deserved documentation. He sat for 6 hours of recorded interviews, describing Bougainville and Tarawa and Iwo Jima with technical precision. The interviewer asked if Stein considered himself a hero. Stein said no. He'd been a problem solver who happened to be good at mathematics. 8 tanks minus 3 rockets equaled creative thinking or death. He chose thinking. In 1982, Stein attended his first Marine Corps reunion since 1945. Other veterans recognized his name from the oral histories. Several were officers now, colonels and generals who'd been privates and corporals when Stein trained them at Camp Pendleton. Colonel James Morrison, formerly PFC Morrison from the 1943 training course, told Stein that he'd taught a generation to think like hunters instead of targets. Morrison commanded an infantry regiment now. His Marines still learned the tactics Stein had pioneered 40 years earlier. The conversation made Stein uncomfortable. He'd done what the situation required. Survival had demanded innovation. The fact that his improvisations became doctrine was accidental, not intentional. Morrison disagreed. Doctrine changed because Stein had proved the old doctrine was wrong. Proving institutions wrong required courage that had nothing to do with facing enemy fire. The 1990s brought new wars and new weapons, but old tactics. American infantry in the Gulf War used Javelin missiles against Iraqi armor. The missiles were technologically sophisticated, but the employment doctrine was pure Bougainville. Shoot from unexpected positions, relocate immediately, use terrain to channel enemy movement. After-action reports from Desert Storm could have been written in 1943, with only the weapon names changed. In 2003, Stein was 83 years old and dying from cancer. The Marine Corps sent a liaison officer to his hospice bed to inform him that his oral history interviews had been declassified and published. The transcripts were being used at officer training schools as case studies in tactical innovation under pressure. Stein listened to this information and asked a single question. Did the current doctrine keep Marines alive? The officer said yes. Casualty rates from anti-armor operations were significantly lower than historical averages. Stein nodded. That was the only metric that mattered. Tony Stein died January 17th, 2003. His obituary in the local paper mentioned his military service in a single sentence. The Marine Corps Times ran a longer tribute, highlighting his Navy Cross and his contributions to anti-armor doctrine. Most readers didn't recognize the name. The tactics he'd pioneered were so thoroughly integrated into training that they seemed obvious, eternal, the way things had always been done. Modern Marines learn to shoot and move without knowing that static defense had once been standard doctrine. They learned terrain exploitation without knowing a Cleveland machinist had invented the concept while facing impossible odds on a Pacific island. The institutional memory had absorbed the innovation so completely that the innovator became invisible. Today, infantry around the world train in mobile anti-armor tactics. American forces, NATO allies, even former adversaries use principles that trace back to May 15th, 1943. The weapons have changed. Javelins, NLAWs, Panzerfaust 3s, shoulder-fired missiles with capabilities Stein couldn't have imagined. But the tactics remain. A training sergeant at Camp Pendleton teaches shoot and move doctrine to new Marines. He demonstrates optimal displacement patterns, explains terrain exploitation, and emphasizes team leader autonomy. He doesn't mention Tony Stein's name because he doesn't know it. The doctrine exists independent of its creator now, proven through 80 years of combat, refined through multiple wars, validated across every terrain and enemy. Somewhere in the Marine Corps archives, Stein's hand-drawn tactical diagrams sit in a file box alongside thousands of other historical documents. The sketches show movement patterns, fields of fire, the mathematics of 3 rockets against 5 tanks. The solution that changed how infantry thought about armor. The impossible problem that stopped being impossible once one corporal decided doctrine was negotiable, but survival wasn't. 8 Japanese tanks against 1 Bazooka team. The mathematics that required creativity. The innovation that became an institution. The story that disappeared into the doctrine it created.